My name is Bridget Boyle. I'm an architectural historian and so pleased to be able to present a little bit of architecture to your art history class. The object I'm going to present is one of my favorites, the Vanna Venturi house, which was a small house designed by Robert Venturi in 1964 outside of Philadelphia. The architectural object is a lot like the art history objects that you've been looking at this semester. It's an intersection of different and sometimes competing interests of tradition and autonomy, artistic intention, economic pressures, questions of labor, of technology, race, gender, many, many others. Everything you've learned in your class so far is equally applicable in architecture. Don't be persuaded by the sturdiness of this object. The reason I chose this house is because it's an important benchmark in architecture. Though quite small, it has an outsized legacy, credited more than any other building as the first postmodern work of architecture. And Venturi, the architect, credited and actually also blamed for this disciplinary turn. You might know Venturi if you've been to the Seattle Art Museum, which he also designed. So, what is postmodernism? That's a super tough question, and one that doesn't really have a straightforward and conclusive answer. It's both a style and an idea. It's a reaction to old and the proposition of new perspectives. It's about layers and multitudes and multiples of belief and meaning, even of truths. One of my professors described it by quoting a Supreme Court justice who was trying to define pornography. Quote, "You know it when you see it." I think you've all read Roland Barthes' Death of the Author by now. Postmodernism is the result of the birth of many, many readers. In architecture, though, postmodernism was understood first and foremost as a reaction to the buildings of high modernism. These are the buildings that thought architecture could solve the problems of society. They're heroic and functional. They've got clean lines and singular ideas. You may have heard the phrase, quote, "less is more," which was a catchphrase of Mies van der Rohe. Well, catchphrase may not be the right answer. He's the architect of the building in the middle on the bottom row. He's a very serious German. But that phrase does describe most of the buildings of high modernism. But the modern project failed. To be specific, the modern project failed at 3:32 p.m. on July 15th, 1972. That was when this complex of buildings, the Pruitt-Igoe Housing Complex in St. Louis, built less than 2 decades earlier and meant to provide ample green space in an urban environment, aka the tower in the park model of architecture. That's when these buildings were demolished by the city of St. Louis after the city realized that the cost of fixing the problems of the buildings well outweighed the very, very high cost of blowing them up. After years of neglect and abandonment of inaccessible city services and the express facilitation of white flight to the suburbs, the idealistic project of heroic modern architecture was deemed unlivable. Back to our house. I'm going to do a few things with this object. First, a little bit of background on Venturi, the artist. We'll show why the house seems like a logical outcome of his own education and historical position. We'll see what makes the house postmodern, the idea, and also a precursor to, quote, postmodernism, the style. And then I'll give a few possible different interpretations of the house so you can see how an architectural historian looks at things, and also in order to perform our own kind of postmodern reading of it. We'll use the published and circulated images of the building as our primary object. Robert Venturi began designing this 1,800 square foot house for his mother in the late 1950s, while he was teaching what he called a somewhat subversive version of a theory class at both Penn and Yale. The content from this course had emerged from his travels afforded by the Rome Prize, a prestigious architectural prize, which he had won in 1954, 4 years after graduating from Princeton, twice, undergrad in 47 and his master's in 1950. There, he had studied under Jean Labateau and Donald Drew Egbert, both of whom had advocated for history's role in architecture. And both also produced their own work with subtly religious overtones. This is in contradistinction to the currents of international style modernism reverberating throughout the US, a movement shepherded by der Zeitgeist rather than one of faith. Venturi actually worked for quite famous modernists, Eros Saarinen, Oscar Stoneroff, and eventually Louis Kahn. You might recognize the St. Louis Arch on the left and Stoneroff's Hopkinson House, which was in Philadelphia. And this is the Salk Institute on the right by Louis Kahn. Totally stunning and worth a visit if you're ever outside San Diego. The course that he taught soon became a book called Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which was a thin book full of many, many, but very small images. Here, against the decisive position of modernism, Venturi espoused new theories of architectural ambiguity, of multivalence, of richness, vitality, messiness. In short, referring back to Mies and that movement that he stood for, quote, less is a bore. The house, like the book, is full of historical reference that Venturi redeployed out of context and juxtaposed one upon the other. The split gable, much like Luigi Moretti's building in Italy, is it a complete whole or is it two separate pieces? The ribbon window, a reference to the Villa Savoie facade, which was the most famous piece of modern architecture at the time. The broken pediment is wood molding. It's applied to the surface, obviously not structural, and announces itself as such through its break and intersection with the lintel above the empty void of the entrance. This rewrites Renaissance architecture in the same way that Mannerist architecture did in the 16th century, both historical references. The way these ideas become transformed into a style can be seen here in Piazza d'Italia, which is in New Orleans and designed by Charles Moore, where he kind of selected various phrases from history and eclectically put them together. The house also has references that are symbols of domesticity and communicate the function of domesticity through the building. The pitched roof, the oversized chimney, the square window, and the molding on the front is actually Renaissance, but at this small scale, it becomes instead an inversion of interior domestic space, the chair rail brought outside. Again, it's too high for this actually to be the case, so it makes the viewer question their own scale on how big the house actually is. Everything is reduced to the flat surface of the facade made of stucco, and it looks almost like a drawing, actually a child's drawing of the house, which is in fact how he drew it. We can also tell in this project that the audience of postmodern architecture changes when communication becomes a more important value. You can see that in a building like this, which is the Longaberger Basket Building in Ohio. It's an embrace of pop culture on the one hand and a questioning of it on the other. There are other aspects of postmodern architecture worth mentioning, but not so obvious to point to in this facade. In this case, a new investment in the drawing as distinct from the building, which you can see in the Portland building by Michael Graves, and also the architecture as the sightless non-place of late capitalism, which is described in a very famous essay by Frederick Jameson about the Bonaventure Hotel in Los Angeles by John Portman. So there you have it. You know it when you see it. But to describe this house in purely postmodern terms is to allow Venturi to tell the story, to allow his specific and edited authorial intention to influence our own reading of an object in our space. Think again of Barthes. In order to make an argument about the house, we have to find our own story. And in order to do that, we have to let the details speak. There are lots of hidden narratives about architecture here, and also many architectural arguments to be made. For instance, it was painted green after the modernist Marcel Breuer, who near us did the Grand Coulee Dam Visitor Center, said, "Don't ever paint a building green because that's the color of nature." What source did the green paint come from? Was it custom? Was it standard? What other housing or building types is it related to? Or Venturi visually interrupts the straight shaft of the fireplace with this bisecting stare and physically requires it to do this gymnastic turn that results in a crooked flue. How does a crooked flue work? But a couple of the details that I find especially telling are the actual drawing of the details. One of the most remarkable aspects of the house are the way that Venturi drew these details. Both interior and exterior are quite minimal, without any attention to fasteners or tectonic connections. The details are flat but clean, bereft of any indication of how these things attach to each other. What kind of fastener did he use? Why don't we see it? In this first instance of a style that will become known for its superficiality and excess and overindulgence, we might claim that it's actually held together by superglue. In this detail, we see how precise the tolerances are of these connections. Each is kept 3/4 of an inch away from a flush edge. What Venturi wants this to do is for the molding to call attention to its own artifice, its own application. It makes the house like a drawing where discontinued lines are as easy as picking up your pencil. But in practice, this is actually quite difficult. It requires workers to resist their own habits of construction. It's the opposite of efficient. It's totally belabored, extra time, extra effort. Like the facade itself, made of stucco, it requires a lot of skill to make a facade look so plain. I should have noted that Vanna Venturi was a Quaker, and in terms of this, can we understand the lack of fasteners in a new way? Is glue the only technology aesthetically permissible? Can we think about this building as an essay on plainness? And how does Venturi's plainness compare to modernist minimalism? Really, though, it's a detail of this photograph that I keep coming back to, a picture of Vanna outside of her house sweeping. An entire history of architecture can be written through the mother-son relationships within it. Le Corbusier wrote a letter to his mother every day and built Villa Lalac for her in 1924. Frank Lloyd Wright's mother bought land for her son so that he could build a home to live in with his mistress. Mies van der Rohe refashioned himself by reassuming his mother's surname. Stephen Eisenhower built a home for his mother, so did Richard Meyer, so did Charlie Gwathmey and Charles Moore and many, many others. This one by a guy I went to architecture school with, whose mother has used his drawings to wallpaper the room. Mothers are idealized as perfect clients. They're indulgent, they're patient, they recognize the genius of their most often sons. But this house was built at the cusp of second wave feminism. Women were attending college in record numbers and able to obtain oral contraceptives and legal abortions. They were no longer relegated to the traditional role of wife and mother. Betty Friedan's 1962 feminist mystique argued for exactly this destabilization. New attention and some money was given to daycare centers for working mothers, to gender-based job discrimination, to equal pay for equal work, all of these demanded by groups that would later band together as the National Organization for Women. If the mothers of architects had previously been consigned to the background or present only as a figurehead or a name, the house of Vanna Venturi, a self-proclaimed Quaker, feminist, pacifist, vegetarian, brings the figure of the mother to the forefront and quite literally makes her the poster mother for a new movement and a new architecture. We can argue two things from this premise: that Venturi, who lived on the second floor of the house even after he married his partner Denise Scott Brown, a brilliant urban designer, is unwilling to relinquish Vanna's role as mother. The house solidifies their parent-child relationship. He has to pass through her space on his way upstairs. The balcony outside of his room, constructed for privacy, shows that he actually needs to leave her house before claiming his own interiority. We can then read her house thinking of the roles of women newly unveiled by the feminist mystique, combined with an understanding of the specifics of this site, Pennsylvania, and this client, a Quaker. In this way, the overskilled chimney is not a childish drawing or a reference to history, but rather a reference to Pennsylvania vernacular, the chimney or the bell tower of the one-room schoolhouse. In the schoolhouse, like the Venturi residence, the fireplace is given the privileged place in the room, with functions zoned around it. The role of the female teacher in the Quaker system of early childhood education sets the path for moral and religious observance, something we see in Venturi's own personal history. Like the vernacular precedent, where the teacher's living quarters were attached directly to the school, here, Venturi builds the school of his mother, his teacher. In this case, Venturi is still a heroic architect, perhaps newly aware of new perspectives, but like postmodernism is wont to do, turns this perspective into an image rather than a platform. Look closely at this photograph, where Vanna Venturi is working, laboring, domestic. Look closely. She's so thorough that it seems she's actually sweeping the grass more than the walkway. This is not a story about heroic men. It's a story about ambitious women, about Vanna Venturi, about Anna Lloyd Wright, about Marie Charlotte Amélie Pierre Jeanneret. Women who had no vehicle for their ambition except through their sons. It's therefore about the discipline. Can we go so far to call it villainous? Who made no space for female architects except as models on posters.